So my name is Chris Messina. I work in developer relations at Google. I work on the social web team, and I do a lot of work on web technologies, working on protocols, formats, and other things that hopefully are opening up the web to more and more interesting applications and experiences. The title of my talk today is The Open and Social Web, and I'm going to be telling you a little bit of a story that paints a picture of where we are with things and maybe where we're going. Before I begin, I want to provide you with a little bit of context. First, about me. You can find me on the web at buzz.google.com/Chris Messina. And I'm also on Twitter as Chris Messina. I tried to trick you with those usernames, I know, but hopefully you can figure that out. Today's hashtags for this session is Google Social. I also invite you to join us on Google Wave to discuss this and other sessions today, but specifically for the conversation in the back channel for this talk, visit j.mp/io-Google Social. And one more thing. Because this is a developer conference, I know that you have certain expectations, very high expectations of your speakers, and I don't want you to be disappointed when we get to the end of this talk that there wasn't enough code. So I'm presenting you with fair warning. If you're looking for a lot of code, you want to attend my buddy Joseph Smar's talk, who's in the audience here today, and John Panzer's talk this afternoon from 3 to 4 p.m. called Bridging the Islands, Building Fluid Social Experiences Across Websites. That's where you're going to see all the code. Now, because this is Google I/O, and because code is an essential aspect of everything that we're talking about, I did want to provide you with a moment of zen before we get started. So, without further ado, please enjoy this moment. This will have to last you for the next 30, 35 minutes, and that's about it. All right, enough of that introduction. I'd like to get actually into the meat of today's discussion. Starting off with a little bit of a prologue to set the scene. There are going to be a couple characters in today's story. These are our open web technologists. And so they reappear throughout the story and play a very, very important role. In Chapter 1, they introduce a technology called OpenID, which is a profile and identity technology. In Chapter 2, they introduce something called WebFinger, which is a technology for discovering information about email addresses. In Chapter 3, we learn about a whole bunch of new technologies called PubSub, ActivityStreams, and Salmon. And these technologies are put together for rich activity and messaging capabilities across the open web. Now, these 3 chapters only begin to tell the story of the open and social web that is emerging today. The technologies that I'm going to tell you about form the very early stages of what I hope will become the foundation of a much broader, much richer, much larger social web in the coming years. And so we begin. Once upon a time, there was a character named Kate and a character named Jack. Of course, Jack lived on this island, Kate lived on this other island. And one day, Jack and Kate, completely independent of one another, decided to go on vacation. They went from one island to another and happened, as it was, to meet up at the same island, strangely enough. This was a much larger island, of course, but once they arrived, a curious thing happened. They ended up meeting one another and liking each other considerably. In fact, they liked each other so much that they fell in love. Oh, isn't that sweet? Well, not just that, but they also decided to, yes, get married. Things move quickly on this island, apparently. Now, there was a problem, as there always is in such stories as this. The problem was that their family and friends could not join them for their wedding. And this, of course, made them very, very sad. As it happened, when Jack and Kate were on this island, they had to leave their family and friends behind on the islands where they originally came from. Why was this? Well, as it turned out, travel had gotten increasingly difficult after Jack and Kate had left. In fact, every time people visited a new island, they were stopped at the border, and they were turned away. Or, when they arrived, they had to go through a series of steps that were really frustrating. Specifically, they had to fill out forms like this. In fact, every island that they visited presented them with a new form to fill out. Some sort of arcane nonsense about usernames and maiden names and all this nonsense. It wasn't just that immigration was really hard. Every new island that they visited required them to learn a secret chant so that you could come back at some later date and revisit without going through all these steps. Well, as it turned out, of course, the more islands you visited, the more of these secret chants you had to learn. And there was very little upside for you to actually keep track of all this information. It just became this completely overwhelming situation where people couldn't manage all of these pieces of information in order to go from one place to another. In fact, this caused so much stress that people just stopped traveling. However, some of the big fat cats on some of the islands decided that this was a very interesting opportunity to create some business. So the fat cats got together and decided that they would make it possible for their inhabitants of their islands to travel freely from one island to another. Now, this was all well and fine for the bigger islands, but of course, as you saw on the map earlier, we're dealing with an archipelago, I think that's how you say that word, which of course pissed off all the little people on the islands. They didn't like it one bit at all. So they resorted to asking their friends, the open web technologists, if they could do anything about it. Well, of course, they were able to come up with a solution, and that solution is called OpenID. How many of you are familiar with OpenID? How many of you use OpenID on a daily basis? Okay, it's probably actually more of you, but that's okay. For those of you who don't know what OpenID is, you can kind of think of it as a skeleton key for a number of accounts that you have across the web. That is, you can sign up for an account on one website and use it to sign in or sign up on another website. It's actually very convenient. Now, from an adoption perspective, we're actually seeing some promising figures. In fact, as of last summer, so these numbers are a little bit dated, but I imagine they've actually improved considerably since then, we've seen from next to no OpenID relying parties, that is the websites that consume OpenID, to over 50,000 today. So we've seen a nice growth curve there in terms of adoption of this technology. Another thing that's very important to understand about OpenID in the wild is that the usage trends themselves reflect a very interesting and important aspect of a decentralized identity technology. Namely, that people prefer to use different accounts in different contexts. That is, if they have more than one profile on the web, they will choose to use a specific profile in certain contexts. So one profile provider may not be sufficient. For example, on a site called User Voice, we see that people make use of their Google accounts 34% of the time and their Facebook accounts 33% of the time. And from there, we see other accounts like Twitter and Yahoo as well. On Interscope Records, which of course is the home for Lady Gaga and Eminem, Lenny Kravitz, and so on, we see a very different type of statistic, where a full 43%, 52% of people choose to use their Facebook accounts to sign in. And meanwhile, we see a number of other providers that people choose to use in this context. Now, most of the Interscope sites actually promote heavily the use of Facebook or Twitter Connect, and yet people still are choosing to use their other profiles, even despite the user experience that's been designed to promote those two providers. Finally, we see something really different when we look internationally. So if you go to a site that serves essentially as the eBay of the Philippines, in this case, 64% of their users are using Yahoo accounts as their third-party authentication provider. So if this site chose to only support one third-party profile provider, they would be cutting off a large number of their other users, which of course would be very bad for business. And finally, Janrain, which is a company that provides a plugin called RPX that makes it possible to incorporate third-party authentication into websites, sees very interesting statistics in aggregate across all the different websites that use their product. Specifically, 38%, 39% of sites actually see the usage of Google profiles and Google accounts to sign in. Second by Facebook, Yahoo, Twitter, and others. And I think this paints a very important picture that must be remembered, especially in the context of the island nation of the internet. To learn more about this technology, I invite you to visit OpenID.net. So once again, these open web technologists had produced this technology that solved a very important problem for islanders. It made it possible for them to have a sort of passport that they could bring with them wherever they went to these other islands, which made it possible for them to visit with their friends and their family and the people that were important to them, and yet still live someplace else. This, of course, made both the fat cats and the island inhabitants very happy. Which brings us to chapter 2. Once people, of course, were able to move freely between islands, it turned out that they did, and they decided to relocate. So you remember before we have Kate, and Kate lives on this island. We have Jack, who lives on this island. Two completely different islands. Now what's interesting is that Kate and Jack's friends used to be able to send messages or make phone calls to Kate or Jack, provided they were on the same island. Once Kate and Jack left to go to the new island, it became increasingly challenging for their friends and family to stay in touch. Because now they couldn't just say, pick up the phone and call Kate, because now they had to specify Kate at a certain island. Well, of course, you can imagine how this solution came about. Once again, our friends, the open web technologists, got together in a room, probably an open mailing list, of course, and decided to develop a new protocol called WebFinger. WebFinger is a technology built on what's called the Hammer Stack, named after the creator of sorts, Aaron Hammer, which has a bunch of different pieces of information that allows you to discover information about web resources. So let's take a look at how that looks. So imagine you go to a form on some website, and you want to find out information about an email address. Well, we type the email address into the box, we click lookup, and what happens is that web server basically takes the domain from that email address and looks in what's called a well-known location. So you can see what they've done is they've taken that Gmail address, they split off the username, they take gmail.com and look in this specific place, .wellknown/hostmeta. The file that is returned looks like this. This provides a way to look up information about this email address by looking for what's called the rel LRDD, essentially a link resource descriptor. You now take the email address, you prepend ACCT to turn this into what's called an account URI, and you plug that into this URI template. All right, hopefully this is kind of making sense so far. This is essentially how you find out information about this email address. So now we're going to take that URL that we've constructed, and we're going to curl against it to find out what kind of information the server has. All right? And you'll note, too, that the WebFinger location is actually not on gmail.com. In this case, it's actually on google.com. So the email provider could actually point to somebody else as being the authority for information about this email address. So let's pull that document back and take a look at it. What you see here is the LRDD profile for this email address, which has a number of services listed. Now what this means is that if I want to perform OpenID authentication against this email address, all I need to do is look for the specific OpenID service in this discovery document, which happens to be here. So if we put this all together to use WebFinger with OpenID authentication, this is how the user experience would work. We switch from this lookup activity to a connect activity. I type my email address in as I would before, and this time what happens is that I'm brought directly to Google to perform authentication. Because in the background, the server has performed WebFinger lookup, has received that document with my OpenID service listed in it, and is now forwarding me over to Google to authenticate. Once I click sign in, I'm returned back to the place where I started from, signed in as Chris Messina. And so in this way, we've actually used the WebFinger protocol to discover information about email addresses in a distributed, decentralized way that in this case makes OpenID much easier for many, many people to use. We no longer have to rely on URLs as a primary key for users. To learn more about WebFinger, I invite you to visit this site. So once again, now that the open web technologists had developed this technology, islanders could now keep in touch with each other regardless of where they chose to live. And so they could move about freely and stay in touch because this WebFinger service provided a sort of forwarding service to look up information about their friends and family who might have moved to a new place, which once again led people to be very, very happy, and so they partied all night. Now, Chapter 3. Chapter 3 contains a lot of information about a number of emerging technologies. In this case, we want to talk about how people were able to keep in touch and share with one another now that they had moved to new islands. So in this case, what was very difficult with all these islands being distributed was that when people wanted to send messages back and forth to one another, they essentially had to go from one place to another, back and forth, constantly checking, polling for new messages. Got anything new? Anything new for me yet? How about now? How about now? No? No, nothing? Okay, well, and eventually people got very frustrated with this whole process. It was slow, cumbersome, it was annoying, it was inefficient. There are all these problems with this model. Furthermore, people started to actually do more interesting things, and they wanted to share richer and richer media that was no longer possible to send over these more minimal communication channels. They also wanted to let other people know about their activities that they were doing all across all these different islands as they explored their new worlds. And once again, when people wanted to share this richer and richer information, the formats that they had really just didn't express this stuff in a very rich way, in a way that also allowed them to send these messages back to the place where they needed to go. So our web technologists decided to get together and come up with a series of technologies that all work together to solve these problems, to make it possible to share rich activity information with their friends, regardless of where they lived or what island they happen to be on. The first of those technologies is what's called PubSub-Hubbub, which on the one hand may be an unfortunate name, but the islanders were very creative, and so that's what they came up with. You know, you have a few Mai Tais too many, whatever, it all works out. In this case, the architecture of PubSub-Hubbub is what's interesting. So in the previous model, you remember that Kate had to go back and forth checking for new messages from Walt. Well, what if Walt could just post a message and have it arrive in real time, essentially, wherever Kate happened to be? Well, the solution that they came up with was to involve a hub and a series of tubes. So by posting this message through the series of tubes to the hub was able to deliver this message in real time to Kate, wherever she happened to be. What was also very interesting about this model is that it scaled pretty well. So you could actually have a number of different subscribers receiving information in real time. Now, we've slowed this down a lot, so you can see how it happens. But basically, the idea is that the message goes in one end and goes through the hub and is posted in real time to the subscribers. And that's actually all I'm going to say about that, because it's amazing. Now, of course, it's one thing to be able to post messages in real time from one place to another using basic formats. Well, once people started to do more and more interesting things on these islands, they needed a richer way of expressing information to their friends. Their friends could get the information that was most valuable to them, wherever they happened to be, in a way that captured the fidelity of those activities. The story of activity streams actually starts centuries ago in 1999. Back in 1999, the world was a very different place. People posted information to websites, but were very careful about other people actually having access to that information or being able to take it from their websites because they cared about something called stickiness. Stickiness was a concept that was very important during the portal era of the web, where information would be posted from one place to another in minimal form. So for example, you would take an article like this, posted to, let's say, the New York Times, and get this information into a portal that looks something like this. Now, the format that expressed this information was very, very primitive, very basic, kind of like stick figures on rocks. Essentially, the RSS format specified a very minimal number of things, of attributes, to make it possible to take that information from one place to another. Specifically, it only really called for providing a link, a title, and a description, which, given the portal model, was sufficient at the time. And given how people were somewhat concerned about their information leaking from one place to another, and that whole stickiness phenomenon, this is about what people were able to come up with. Well, let's fast forward 6 years to 2005. In 2005, a new format was produced called Atom. Now, Atom was a slight re-articulation of the ideas expressed in RSS, and they added some additional critical attributes, specifically an author. Of course, who wrote the piece is very important. A unique ID so that you could identify the story if it came from multiple sources, and when it was last updated, a sort of timestamp so that you could actually differentiate between what the most recent version of the story was. But this format was still predicated on the notion of providing information to portals, essentially bringing this information in a very stripped-down, minimal way to these places that people would use as, I guess, their home pages. Well, let's fast forward to today, in 2010. And we still see this type of information being produced largely in this format, which makes a whole lot of sense. However, in the last decade, the best experience that we have in today's modern browsers for consuming that information looks something like this. And if you think about how the portals used to look versus how modern browsers present this information, not a whole lot has changed. And so as the social web has evolved, we're still relying on the same basic format for expressing this information and syndicating it from one place to another. When it comes to machines helping us to filter this information and figure out what the most relevant bits are, how are they supposed to differentiate if all of it looks the same? And yet we know that people are actually engaging in richer and richer and more diverse activities across the web, even across the same websites. They're doing different types of activities. Well, all this is the backstory for the activity streams format. And what we've essentially done is we've taken that basic format for RSS and Atom of author, title, and link as the sort of primitive structures for this information, and we've changed it just slightly to express information in an author, verb, object archetype with an optional target. For example, when you're posting photos to a photo album or posting something to a wish list. The other thing that we've done is we've taken the Atom format, which again only specifies these 6 attributes as being very important. And we've layered in a verb, an object type, and again a target. And we've actually reused the author element as the actor. So what's nice is that if you're already producing an Atom feed of content on your website, upgrading to produce the activity streams format is actually rather simple. In fact, this is an example of Atom and activity streams woven together. The important pieces here to notice are these. This basic additional information allows a consumer of activity streams to identify a person that posted a note. Now, that seems very simple and very primitive. I mean, this is the same essential information that we had before, except that we can use that structure and those 3 pieces of information to encompass a whole lot of different types of activities. For example, if a person shared a link, or if somebody started following somebody else, maybe even you. But this need not be just about people. It can also be used for services, for example, to update their status. So these primitive structures can actually do a whole lot to help people find out what's going on across the distributed social web. Now, there's another nice feature here, which I think is very important to point out. In the earlier days of RSS and Atom, and increasingly now, as all this information and all our friends are starting to produce more and more information, we're left with kind of an information glut. Now, on the one hand, people call this information overload, but I would call it information abundance. It's as though we have this massive coal, and yet we haven't figured out how to actually refine it yet to do more interesting things. And so, of course, on the one hand, this information abundance comes in and pummels us over the head to the point where, we just can't deal with it anymore. And this is the whole idea of information overload. It's just stressful. What are we supposed to do with all this information? Activity streams, in contrast, makes it possible to actually filter this information based on that actor-verb-object model so that we're getting the information that we need when we need it from the people that we most care about. Now, the third technology that I want to talk to you about is bleeding edge. It's not even final yet. In fact, you'll hear more about it this afternoon from John Panzer and Joseph Smar, and it's a technology called Salmon. Now, when I talked to you about PubSub previously, one of the interesting aspects of this model was that the information flowed from one place, in this case Walt, to Kate, in a unidirectional way. That is, it flowed from one place to another without necessarily providing a way to respond back. And so if Kate wanted to actually respond, it's not clear how she would do that. So Salmon provides a mechanism to actually respond to these activities in real time using a push mechanism that looks a little bit like this. So essentially, she writes something, the little salmon comes along, and because salmon have actually very good senses of smell, they're able to find their way back to the original poster's source in a way that's actually secure and fast. The other nice feature of Salmon is that it works for mentioning people across different islands. So in this case, let's say that Kate posts a message that she wants to share with her friends, but her friends happen to be on different islands. The messages arrive at the proper place because they've been addressed to people elsewhere. So in this case, this goes back to Jack on the island of clickset.com. And in this case, John receives the message on the island of Atolia. So by posting these messages in a certain way, using WebFinger-based identifiers, again, essentially email addresses, we're able to send these messages back without relying on the email infrastructure. So this works over HTTP by just posting information back to Salmon endpoints. I'm not going to tell you more about this now because Joseph and John have to have something to talk about this afternoon, but I do invite you to learn more about these technologies at j.mp/pubsubhubbub, activity streams, and salmon-protocol.org. Combining these technologies, the open web technologists essentially were able to provide a mechanism for people distributed across all these different islands to stay in touch in a rich way and to communicate in real time and to respond back regardless of where they happen to live, which of course once again made everybody extremely happy this time. And so they all lived, at least in this case, happily ever after. Now, no story is complete, of course, without an epic log. And so in Chapter 1, we learned about OpenID, an identity and profile technology, which is currently being revved in a very important way. But this technology allowed for islanders to essentially identify each other as they traversed the known waters of the island of space or something. In Chapter 2, we learned about WebFinger, a way for learning more about email addresses, which are more familiar to people, as a way of representing who they are as they communicate with one another. And as we just heard about in Chapter 3, activity streams, Salmon, and PubSub provides a mechanism for people to stay in touch regardless of where they went. Now, all of this provides a useful backdrop for Google and the social web, and where Google wants to see the social web go. Of course, I'm using this island metaphor to illustrate where we are with the web today, and where I think the web should move to enable cross-site social networking activities to occur. By leveraging a number of emerging technologies, we're starting to see the emergence of a social web that is actually the entire scale and scope of the web itself, as opposed to being restricted to any one particular island. And for us, that ability to have choice among which islands you tend to spend your time in is fundamental. And in fact, these technologies are forming the foundation for the Buzz platform. Dwight Clinton, who is one of my coworkers, actually wrote in a Buzz that the idea behind Buzz is that someday any host on the web should be able to implement these open protocols and technologies without any one company in the middle. And that specifically, Google Buzz itself would just be another node, a very good one we hope, of course, among many peers. And by stringing all these things together and promoting the technologies that power an open and social web, we hope to make the entire web experience much better for many, many more people for years and decades to come. So with that, I'd like to conclude. Of course, I'd also like to thank Jack and Kate for their participation in this talk. And I'd also like to remind you to check out the back channel discussion on Google Wave, j.mp/io-Google Social. And a couple more advertisements for you. I'd like to invite you to check out What's the Hubbub About Google Buzz APIs, presented at 1:45 next in room 8 by Chris Chabot. Later on, again this afternoon, from 3 to 4 p.m., Bridging the Islands, which will be the code-centric version of this talk, I hope, presented by Joseph and John. And finally, tomorrow, this is not today, this is tomorrow, a fireside chat with the social web team from Google from 2:15 to 3:15 in the fireside chat room. And so that's all I have, and so I open the floor for questions and answers. And the one request that I have, well, let's make it two, is that if you do have a question, you come up to the mic, and that your question begins with a capital letter and ends in a question mark. Otherwise, we're good. All right, well, thank you very much for your attention. Questions, yes.
Hello. Hi, thanks. Have you given much thought to like long-term data retention for all of this social media activity? So like one thing that comes to mind for me is the Library of Congress deal with Twitter, right? That's going to live forever. Have you thought about maybe time to lives or expirations on any of this data so it's just not out there forever?
So the question is about data retention. And of course, data retention has a lot of different ramifications to it. What I would say is that the thing that I'm most interested in with a lot of these technologies and protocols is, first of all, making it possible for this data to flow between different places. When it comes to the retention of this information, I feel like that's both a provider-specific implementation point as well as an individual choice aspect of this. So whether you prefer for your data to be captured and sequestered and stored for eons or for 5 minutes should be possible using these technologies. So the technologies themselves and these protocols don't necessarily need to, I think, provide a policy for that. But I do hope that the choice, increasing the number of choices on the social web, would enable people to have the ability to pick a provider that meets their needs. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Other questions? No? All right, well, you guys are free to go then. Thank you very much. Oh,
Okay.
oh, sorry. Oh. One more question, yes.
What in the stories that you told, there are two people.
Yes.
And I'm as a person, I have multiple personalities. I mean, I'm an individual, I'm working in my place, I'm a member of some social club, and I have multiple ideas. how it's going in this type of, so sometimes I'd like to connect multiple islands to different, or multiple things to different IDs that I can choose what.
So you're talking about personas.
Yeah.
So one of the things that's very important to me, and I think to a lot of people that work on these protocols and technologies, doesn't, on the one hand, go back to the ability to have choice in the providers that you use. The second piece, which I think answers your question in some ways, is that identity in particular is a very complex issue. And so providing people with the means to express different facets of their identity in different contexts, I think is extremely important. However, one of the challenges that we have with a lot of the emerging social web technologies is, first of all, to make it easy enough for many more people to implement and adopt these technologies that first allow for federated identity to work on the web, and then secondly, to provide for these more expressive mechanisms that allow you to actually segment your profile if you choose to.
Or if I have multiple profiles?
Or if you have multiple profiles, precisely. Because we don't have that basic fundamental layer yet expressed either in the web itself or in web browsers, it's very hard to even approximate the type of feature that you're requesting. However, once again, nothing in these technologies prohibits or inhibits that possibility from existing in the future. So ideally, with getting more people involved in these things, we can actually see those types of use cases developed more and played out more fully. Okay, another question?
Chris, you have a bit more time. There are a lot of questions in Wave in the moderator.
Oh, are there? Okay.
I don't know if you're able to pull that up there. You should be able to.
I don't know. I turned off the internet on my computer. Somebody want to tell me the questions on moderator, please? Okay, so the question is about who owns the content that gets aggregated and syndicated, I suppose, into all these applications. And that also is a very tricky question, and one that I don't know that we have either the policy or the technological means to address completely. Part of it is because social data itself is inherently a new type of, well, intellectual asset that I don't quite know how it's going to actually play out. So for example, if I post a photo on the social web and you download that photo to your hard drive, should I have the right to delete that photo off of your hard drive? Well, this is an expectation that some people actually have. And yet, on the other hand, the person who downloaded that photo would think very differently about it. Now, we've adapted our expectations, for example, of email, such that when we send an email to somebody else, we don't necessarily expect to be able to take it back, especially if that information goes from one server to another. We might be able to even develop the technical means to make it possible to retract those emails, but that creates a different type of social expectation and a different type of social contract than people currently expect. And so while we can do many, many things from a technological perspective, there's still a lot of behavioral things that need to be worked out between people and between what their expectations are to answer those questions fully. So unfortunately or fortunately, we're spending a lot more time, again, just making it possible for the data to flow in the first place, and then hope that people will be able to work out the different policy mechanisms that will be enforced through other means once the technology is there. Other questions?
I can read you the top few off moderator if you want.
Mm-hmm.
So let's see. Now I'm on the spot. How do you see Buzz competing with Facebook or Twitter?
Very well, I hope. Yeah, I think one of the goals, again, with Buzz is for there to be a much broader set of people supporting these technologies. And in fact, we've been working with, through the community, Twitter and Facebook to make it possible for, whether it's activity streams or authentication information, profiles, to be able to become much more interoperable. We're at the very, very early stages of the development of the social web, and I think hopefully this competition will actually force everybody to focus on the user and to provide better experiences, I think, through these emergent technologies.
So social streams looks like the syntax for those kinds of interchanges. How are people thinking about managing the semantics, like what types of messages, activities, et cetera?
Right, so when it comes to developing activity streams, and specifically the schema, I'll say, what we've done so far through the community is we've actually done a great deal of research borrowing from the microformats process. Namely, we've gone out across the social web and we've looked for existing examples of activities that are being produced by social websites, and we've extracted common patterns. From those common patterns, we've come up with a list of 40 verbs and object types that Buzz currently supports as a subset, but that we hope to see many more providers start to produce. Over time, because we've made it possible for the extensibility model of activity streams to support URI-based verbs and object types, you could essentially develop your own set of verbs and object types that you use to interoperate with different providers. So I think this creates a very good foundation for people to do interop between different places, but we're starting by looking at what's already in the wild as opposed to inventing things that don't already exist. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
So user-facing privacy controls have seemed to be very challenging. On the one hand, you have Facebook, which has this incredibly complex tree. On the other hand, Buzz faced some challenges early on. Now you have locked down almost completely, which is good. Are you working on a better vision for simplified user-facing privacy controls that are also effective?
So this is one of the questions that keeps me up at night in a lot of respects. As you notice, there's not a lot of code in this talk. That's because my background is actually as a designer and as a user experience creator. And as a result of that, I've been watching very carefully not only all the privacy interfaces that, of course, are being developed, but also trying to understand how to communicate to people different social contexts and environments, and who is able to see the things that they publish and produce, and what their expectations are. This is an extremely large challenge, because from an interface perspective, you want to, of course, get out of the way of the user. But from a user perspective, if things don't work out the way that you expect them to, then your trust gets eroded. And so we haven't quite found the right balance between making it very easy for people to express their privacy and publicity desires with an interface that does get out of their way. That said, we've done a lot of research, and I think are developing a number of new interfaces and interactions to help with that. And I've personally been doing work through the OpenID Foundation, and we'll be doing much more of that this summer, to develop a series of user interaction guidelines that might help with that respect. But we don't have a great story necessarily today.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
Do you know of any good examples of things that you think might be for example, good examples of sites that do this really, really well?
So the question is about whether or not there are examples of sites that do this type of thing very well. And one of the things that I do is I take a lot of screenshots of web interfaces. I invite you to check out flickr.com/FactoryJoe to see some of these interfaces. But I do think that, for example, a service called Brightkite does a pretty good job with some of these things. I think that the Buzz interface is actually not a bad start. I think that even some of the things that Facebook does are very innovative and very interesting, though, of course, trying to work to create perhaps more of an industry standard for expressing this information to people is something that still needs to be done. So other than that, I don't have great examples yet.
So the next one is an adoption question around federation, like some of the stuff you talked about. What will it take for data replication to stop and a peer-to-peer distributed singular data set arise as the social framework?
Can you repeat that?
What's going to take to make the federation actually happen is the spirit of it.
So one of the things that I'll tell you about that I think is actually very interesting and very exciting just came out this past Friday. David Ricordan, one of the original architects and authors of OpenID, wrote a proposal that pulls together a number of different ideas and concepts that have been floating around the community for some time and put it into a proposal called OpenID Connect. So if you visit OpenIDConnect.com, you can find out information about this emerging idea. Essentially, to answer your question, one of the things that we've run into as a challenge in terms of getting these technologies adopted is providing the right level of benefit to publishers as well as to users. So OpenID is a technology that largely came out of a security and privacy-centric community of people. And the challenge that we've seen in the last several years with the development of other Connect-style APIs is that single sign-on alone is not sufficient to provide publisher value. So we're reworking parts of OpenID to make it possible to not only identify someone who chooses to log in with a certain profile, but also to get access to the data that they choose to share. So combining OAuth 2.0 and OpenID together the hope is that we can actually provide enough publisher value while still preserving the original both decentralization and privacy-centric aspects of OpenID to get wider spread adoption. So it's a number of things, from the user experience to publisher value to the complexity of the technology, and I think we're finally going back to the drawing board in some of these things and making some solid progress, actually, to get better adoption of these technologies.
Hey, thanks for the talk. I have two questions. One, I was wondering if you could comment on the current speed with which tweets are being brought into Buzz, because I know they happen really quickly on a Google search, but then on Buzz sometimes it's hours and hours.
Right.
And then the second one, I was wondering if you could give me your opinion on the current Facebook privacy issues in context of the Buzz launch and sort of the hubbub that happened there.
These are tough questions. The first question is about the speed in which tweets are being brought into Buzz, and unfortunately, I'm not the authority for that, so I can't speak to that. The second question is about Facebook and privacy and the Buzz launch and so on. And the thing that I would say about that is, first of all, there's a lot of improvements that have been made to Buzz since it launched, and I think that we've learned a great deal in that process. I'm not specifically on the Buzz product team, though I know that there are countless conversations and debates that have gone on to improve the product and to make it more responsive to people's expectations. As I said in my previous answer, this is a very wide open area, and one that deserves not only a great deal of study, but also I think the involvement of a lot more disciplines to understand what's going on. So I'm personally watching all these things very closely, both as a designer and as a technologist, and I think we're going to start seeing a lot more of these ideas actually being built into the Buzz platform itself. From a technology perspective, though, we're trying to make sure that we can be generative and expressive in how people manifest these things so that these technologies work in both very public environments as well as places where people have greater expectations of privacy or control. So I can't provide a more specific answer than that, but that's how I would address that question. Any other questions or comments? All right, well, you've been a great audience. Thanks very much.